Hello, and welcome to my presentation on lean home brewing, or Brian's excuse to brew beer for a grade. We'll begin with the basic overview of the home brewing process, so you'll have a general idea of the steps involved. Next, I'll show you my process in its current state, and identify the types of waste that I found in it. Next, I'll present my future state concept goals, and explain the changes I made to achieve those goals. We'll then compare the data from both processes, and measure my success. I'll wrap things up by presenting some ideas for an ideal state for my homebrew process. Let's go. First, let's look at the basic steps involved in home brewing using this process flowchart. First, water is heated in the hot liquor tank, which is just a big kettle. Meanwhile, a grain mill is used to crush the malted barley. And the hot water and barley are then mixed together in the mash tun, an insulated vessel, and are allowed to steep for about an hour, producing what is known as wort. The wort is then transferred to the boil kettle, where it is boiled for another hour with the hops. At the end of the boil, the wort is cooled down using a chiller. And then it is transferred to the fermenter, where yeast is added. It will spend about 2 weeks in the fermenter with the yeast doing their thing, and will eventually produce beer. Hooray, beer. So let's look at how I am currently doing this process. This is a time-lapsed video I shot about 1.5 years ago, which shows me setting up my work cell for a brew day, along with my faithful companion, Steve the dog. I'm sure if you had asked me back then why I set things up like this, I would have had some sort of rationale for it. But if you look at it with a lean mindset, there are issues. There we go. So here's the work cell layout. It's basically an L shape with what I'll call the production line forming one leg and my equipment and supply table or staging area forming the other leg. If you compare it to the process flowchart, it doesn't really make much sense. The vessels are not in any particular order. You got the boil kettle over on the end with the hot liquor tank in the middle, then the mill and the mash tun, and my equipment and supply table way off to one side. And if you spaghetti map it and show the order that the processes are done in the direction that product is moving, you can see it's kind of all over the place, especially with the back and forth motion between the tables and the kettles. In short, this process is full of muda, full of waste. Now, the single biggest waste is in movement, and this movement is both in terms of the number of steps taken, moving back and forth between the processes, and also in equipment handling, as I have to lift kettles at 3 different points and physically pour them from one station to another. And these kettles are heavy and hot, which presents a safety concern. So as it stands right now, I'm taking about 100 steps or more in this process. I have to lift kettles at 3 different points in the process, and those range from 20 to 60 pounds in weight. So that's 9 gallons of hot liquid that I have to move by hand in this process. And for this reason, I often enlist a brewing assistant to help me when possible. And this usually means that they spend about 3.5 hours hanging out on my patio to perform about 10 minutes of work. This is a huge waste of labor. So what I need is some sort of future state. But what do I want to accomplish with this glorious vision of the future? Well, first and foremost, I want to reduce the amount of movement. And this can be measured by the number of steps I take during the process from start to finish. Second, I want to reduce the amount of equipment and product handling as measured by the number of kettles lifted. Third, I would like to eliminate the need for a second worker. And lastly, I would like to reduce the number of safety hazards, also measured by the number of kettles lifted. But before I go to all this trouble, I gotta ask, who cares? In other words, who are my stakeholders? There are a few. There's me, the guy who is doing all this work. I would love to have a streamlined, more efficient brewing process. There are my brewing assistants, usually my dad or my wife. I'm sure they can find better things to do with a Sunday than stand on my patio and watch water boil. My family is a stakeholder. They have a vested interest in my physical well-being, and in having a less strenuous and safer process means that Brian can avoid a trip to the ER with a hernia or scald burns. My homebrew supply guys definitely have a stake in this process, as I am likely to brew more frequently when my brew day becomes more enjoyable, which means I'm going to be spending more money in their homebrew supply shop. And of course, There are always the freeloaders. I mean, my friends. And these are the people who would benefit from increased beer output because it means they get to hang out on my patio and drink my beer for free. And of course, the most important stakeholder of all is Steve. Because if I am happy, Steve is happy. And we all want to make Steve happy, right? Okay, so what should this future state work cell look like? Well, if we go back and look at the process flow chart, you can see that once the hot water and the grains are added to the mash tun, it's a very simple sequential process, with liquid moving from one vessel to the next in one direction. And if we apply this idea to the work cell, we go from this awkward, haphazard L shape to something that more closely resembles the flow chart. I'm going to call this Brew 2.0. So let's break this work cell down. Along the bottom of the photo is the staging area. This is where the table I have where I will do all of the ingredient measuring and gather data during the brew. And along the top of the photo is the production line. Let's take a closer look at that. The new configuration matches the flowchart, with product entering on the far left, moving from vessel to vessel sequentially, then finishing with the fermenter on the far right. Steve will also be around to supervise, of course. This new configuration will reduce the amount of movement from something that looks like this to something that looks like this. A simple, straight line flow through the process steps. Steve approves. Hallelujah. There will also be a little bit of movement between the staging area and the various vessels, but I have reduced this to 1 or 2 steps. In fact, I have calculated that I should only take about 25 steps during this entire process with this new setup. So the new work cell has drastically reduced the amount of time or amount of movement in the process, which will translate into a reduction in time. Next, let's address the issue of equipment and material handling. I've made a few technological upgrades to my brewing process, including installing quick connect valves on the kettles, a motorized pump, and a plate chiller, which cools down the wort much faster than the coil chiller I had been using. Now with the pump mounted in the center of the production line, I can pump product from one vessel to another by simply connecting the silicone tubing to the appropriate kettle valve. This allows me to transfer product without having to lift anything. So, zero lifting means 0 gallons of boiling liquid potentially being dropped on my feet. Steve approves again. Awesome. So, Brew 2.0 has reduced or eliminated the excess movement and equipment handling, and as well as addressing the safety issues with moving the hot, heavy kettles. So how much Muda did we obliterate? Let's compare the data. With Brew 2.0, we went from at least 100 steps to 25 steps or less, which is a 75% reduction in motion. We went from lifting 3 kettles and 9 gallons of liquid to 0, which is a 100% reduction in physical effort in that metric. We went from 3 safety hazards with moving the hot kettles to 0, which is a 90% reduction in safety hazards. I'm calling it 90% because while I have eliminated the need to pick up and move the kettles, they do still present a safety hazard in that they are hot and full of boiling liquid. So I can't call it 100% hazard elimination because there always is a little bit of safety hazards involved. So 90%, I'll take it. Brew 2.0 has also eliminated the need for a second worker. I no longer need to have someone to wait around with me to move these kettles because the pump will do it for me. And that plate chiller that I mentioned a couple minutes ago is going to save me about a half an hour at the end of the process chilling the wort. And between that and the reduction in the amount of walking that I have to do, I estimate it's going to be about 40 minutes in save time for a 3.5 hour brew day, which translates into a 19% time reduction. So now that I have my new work cell designed and I have eliminated much of the waste, am I done yet? No. So what's next? Well, for my ideal state, I've started on 2 projects. First, I've begun drafting a standard operating procedure for my brewing process, and this will cover everything from setup to cleanup. I've also begun designing a brewing rig on AutoCAD. This is a steel tube frame cart that will permanently hold all of my equipment. This will drastically reduce my setup time, as it will allow me to have all of my equipment set up permanently in one place, configured just like the work cell for Brew 2.0. I plan to begin construction this summer. If you would like to check my progress on the brewing rig build, or are interested in home brewing in general, feel free to like my Secret Lair Home Brewing Facebook page. If you just search Secret Lair Home Brewing on Facebook, you should find it. Thanks for watching, everybody. Say cheers, Steve.